Amelia Grace laughed in front of the crew, threw the folder to the floor, and told Mason Carter, a quiet single father working the lowest contract shift, that if he could fix the dying jet, she would sign her whole company over to him. Nobody expected Mason to stay silent, studying the warning panel, recognizing a fault the military had once buried inside a sealed file. 7 minutes of total silence later, the engine roared back to life. The next morning, a call from the Pentagon left Amelia frozen. They were not calling for her. They were calling for him. The story began at a private airfield outside Seattle, on a morning when the rain fell in thin gray sheets across the tarmac. Amelia Grace stood beneath the wing of her company's flagship jet, arms crossed, watching a maintenance crew argue over a dashboard of blinking lights that refused to make sense. She was supposed to be airborne within the hour, bound for Washington to sign a contract that would keep her company from collapsing under years of accumulated debt. The jet would not start. It had failed twice already, and every attempt to restart the engine ended in the same dull silence. Inside the hangar, panic moved through the technical staff like a current. Phones buzzed with messages from the partner firm in Washington, warning that patience was running out and that the deal could be pulled before noon. Cameron Wyatt, the company's director of technical operations, stood at the center of the chaos with a tablet in hand, insisting that the fault lived deep in a secondary control cluster and that the only fix was a full replacement worth millions. Nobody questioned him. He had run this division for years, and his word carried the weight of a verdict rather than a theory. At the edge of the hangar, half hidden behind a row of parts carts, stood a man in a worn work jacket that had seen too many winters. His name was Mason Carter, and he had been called in that morning for nothing more than routine cleanup in the secondary, technical bay. Nobody had summoned him to look at the jet. Nobody expected him to. He was a contract mechanic paid by the shift, the kind of worker whose name rarely appeared on any roster that mattered. Amelia's eyes passed over him the way they passed over the carts and the spare parts, registering him only as part of the background. To her, he was simply another man in an airfield uniform, likely scraping by on temporary work, the sort of person she assumed had no bearing on a company worth what hers was worth. She turned back to Cameron and demanded a timeline, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise of idling generators. Mason said nothing. He rarely did. Instead, he stood a few feet from the nose of the aircraft, listening to the uneven rhythm of the engine's dying attempts to turn over, watching the pattern of the warning lights as they blinked in a sequence that felt oddly deliberate, and breathing in the faint scent of unburned fuel that lingered in the damp morning air. Something about the rhythm bothered him, in a way none of the shouting around him seemed to notice. He had spent enough years around aircraft in circumstances far removed from this hangar to know that a fault this specific rarely came from something as mundane as a worn control cluster. There was a texture to it, a signature almost, that reminded him of systems he had not thought about in a long time. As the argument around him grew louder, Mason quietly filed away one certainty. Whatever was wrong with this jet, it was not the ordinary kind of trouble a commercial aircraft usually carried. Rain drummed steadily on the corrugated roof of the hangar, and the smell of wet asphalt drifted in through the open bay doors along with the cold morning air. Amelia paced near the nose of the aircraft, checking her watch every few seconds as though the gesture alone might somehow move the clock backward. Around her, junior staff members kept their eyes low, careful not to draw her attention while the crisis unfolded. The whole scene had the brittle, anxious energy of a room waiting for bad news it already suspected was coming, and nobody in that space thought to look twice at the quiet man standing near the parts carts. Mason Carter was not a man who explained himself. He moved through his days with the kind of quiet discipline that came from a life spent following procedures where a single mistake could cost more than a job. Few people at the airfield knew anything real about his history, and fewer still had ever asked. What little they assumed was usually wrong, built on the sight of his faded jacket and the modest truck he drove to work each morning. Years earlier, Mason had worked inside a specialized aviation program, one connected to systems most people would never hear about in their lifetime. His records from that period had long since been sealed, filed away under classifications that made even routine background checks come back nearly blank. After an incident he rarely spoke of even to himself, Mason had walked away from that world and rebuilt a quieter life around short-term contracts and steady, unremarkable work. He was a single father, though that fact barely surfaced beyond a single detail. He took every shift he could get because stability mattered more to him than recognition. There was a daughter waiting for him at the end of each day, a photograph taped inside his locker, a reason he never let himself get too comfortable with attention. She never appeared in the noise of the hangar or the arguments among executives. She existed only as the quiet reason Mason kept showing up around the airfield. Mason was treated as a peripheral figure, someone without a title worth mentioning, someone who wore no blazer and carried no clipboard of authority. Cameron Wyatt had made a habit of assigning him the smallest, least visible tasks, the kind that kept him far from anything resembling real diagnostic work. It was not incompetence that kept Mason in the shadows, it was design. Mason understood exactly what Cameron was doing, and he chose silence rather than confrontation. His only interest was finishing each task cleanly and returning home without incident. Amelia had absorbed Cameron's dismissive framing of Mason without ever questioning it, which made it easy for her to overlook him entirely when the crisis with the jet began to unfold that morning. As Mason studied the warning display near the cockpit, he noticed something that struck him as deeply wrong. The fault codes crossing the screen carried a structure that did not match the aircraft's usual diagnostic language. It looked less like an accident and more like something had been deliberately altered, as though someone had gone in and rewritten the sequence of errors to hide whatever the real problem actually was. He asked quietly and without drama whether he might see the maintenance log for the past several weeks. Cameron's response was immediate and firm. The request was denied outright, and Mason was told, not for the first time, that the matter did not concern him. Mason accepted the refusal without protest, but the denial itself told him more than any log entry could have. There was a particular kind of quiet that Mason had learned to read over the years, the kind that settled over a room when someone was protecting a secret rather than simply following procedure. Cameron's refusal carried that quality, sharp and just a little too quick, the tone of a man guarding something rather than a man confident in his own explanation. Mason filed the reaction away alongside everything else he had noticed that morning, careful not to let his face show anything at all. He had learned long ago that patience revealed far more than confrontation ever could, and today felt like a day that would reward exactly that kind of patience. The pressure inside the hangar reached a breaking point when word arrived that the partner firm in Washington would not accept another delay. Amelia read the message twice before setting her phone down, her jaw tight, her patience gone. She walked toward the center of the hangar and demanded that someone tell her, honestly and immediately, how long the repair would actually take. Cameron seized the moment to protect himself. He claimed the problem had grown worse because Mason had supposedly touched a secondary inspection cluster earlier that morning, tampering with something he had no authority to approach. Mason stayed calm and told the truth plainly. He had not gone near that cluster at all. Yet in the tense atmosphere of the hangar, nobody stepped forward to support him, and his denial dissolved into the noise around him. Amelia's composure finally broke. She turned toward Mason in front of the assembled engineers, pilots and ground staff, and let her frustration spill into open mockery. She told him, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that he had no business laying a hand on an aircraft worth tens of millions of dollars. The words landed hard, deliberately so, meant to remind everyone present exactly where a man like him stood in her company's hierarchy. Mason offered only a short reply. He said that whatever Cameron intended to replace was not where the real fault lived. Amelia laughed, sharp and dismissive, convinced that Mason was simply performing mystery to protect his position on the crew. In her mind, a contract mechanic claiming insight beyond the company's own director of technical operations was nothing more than desperate theater. Caught in her own pride and certain of an easy victory, Amelia issued a challenge meant to humiliate him further. She told him, in front of everyone, to fix the jet himself right there, if he was so confident he understood it better than the man who ran the department. The crowd around them broke into laughter, some out of nervous relief, others simply enjoying the spectacle of a lowly mechanic being put in his place. Then came the words that would follow her for the rest of her life. Amelia said that if Mason could get the jet running, she would sign her entire company over to him on the spot. It was meant as a joke, a way to close the humiliation with a flourish, a bet she was certain she would never have to honor. Mason did not react with anger or protest. He simply asked for 7 minutes, a basic set of tools, and temporary access to the secondary control panel. Amelia agreed instantly, amused by his composure, fully convinced that failure was the only possible outcome. As Mason walked toward the aircraft, the crowd's laughter followed him, though his expression remained as unreadable as it had been all morning. Somewhere behind him, he heard Cameron mutter something to a nearby engineer, a remark meant to be quiet but pitched just loud enough to carry, dismissing the entire spectacle as a waste of everyone's morning. Mason let the words pass without reaction. He had been underestimated before, in rooms with far higher stakes than a private hangar full of nervous executives, and he had learned that the fastest way through condescension was simply to let his hands do what his voice never needed to. The rain outside had not let up, and through the open bay door he could see the runway stretching out, dark and wet, waiting for an aircraft that still had no engine. Mason did not approach the aircraft the way the rest of the crew expected. He did not call for expensive replacement parts, and he did not waste a single breath arguing with Cameron about procedure. Instead, he rested his palm against the fuselage near the fuel line access panel, closing his eyes for a moment as he listened to the rhythm of the fuel pump and the faint, irregular pulse of the auxiliary electrical cycle beneath the skin of the aircraft. Several members of the technical crew exchanged amused glances, certain they were watching a man perform a kind of theater meant to buy himself a few more minutes of relevance. Mason ignored them entirely. He asked for one of the auxiliary power lines to be shut down, then requested that it be restored manually, in a specific sequence that made little sense to anyone watching who did not understand what he was actually testing. As the sequence completed, Mason found what he had suspected since the moment he first studied the warning display. A safety identification system buried deep within the aircraft's architecture had locked itself into an old military configuration, one that had no reason whatsoever to exist inside a commercial jet. This was not a manufacturing defect. It was the fingerprint of something that had been installed deliberately and quietly by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. Mason recognized the signature immediately. A control module, originally built for a restricted experimental program that had been shut down years earlier, had somehow found its way into the very aircraft standing in front of him. Cameron's composure began to crack the moment Mason spoke the words aloud, and he stepped forward, trying to interrupt the diagnostic process before Mason could go any further. Mason looked at him for a long moment, and in that look was a quiet understanding that Cameron knew far more about this fault than he had ever admitted to anyone in the company. Amelia, still standing at a distance, had not yet accepted what she was witnessing, but something about Mason's calm, methodical certainty was beginning to unsettle the confidence she had walked in with that morning. Rather than typing commands into a diagnostic terminal, Mason performed a careful, deliberate sequence of manual mechanical adjustments, forcing the system to release its locked configuration and return to a standard operational state. It was not a solution born of software. It was a solution born of understanding exactly how the machine's architecture had been built to fail safely, a kind of knowledge that came only from having worked with systems most people never encountered in their careers. For the first time in hours, the jet's engine gave a low, uneven shudder, then a stronger pulse, as though the aircraft itself had been holding its breath. The hangar, which moments earlier had echoed with laughter and doubt, fell into a silence so complete that the only sound left was the engine slowly beginning to find its rhythm and the sudden extinguishing of the primary warning light that had been blinking since dawn. Nobody in the hangar moved. Even the engineers who had spent the morning certain of Mason's failure stood frozen, watching the dashboard lights settle into a steady green pattern none of them had managed to produce after hours of effort. Mason wiped his hands on a cloth from his back pocket, unhurried, as though the outcome had never truly been in doubt. He did not look toward Amelia for validation, nor toward Cameron for acknowledgement. His attention remained fixed on the aircraft itself, still listening, still cataloging the rhythm of a system he understood far better than anyone standing around him realized. Mason stepped back from the aircraft just as the engine settled into a steady, confident rhythm. The pilot, who had been waiting near the cockpit stairs with barely concealed skepticism, climbed inside to check the instrument readings and confirmed, in a voice touched with disbelief, that every system showed the aircraft ready for flight. What had been a lifeless machine only minutes earlier was now humming with the kind of stability that suggested nothing had ever been wrong at all. Amelia stood frozen at the edge of the tarmac, unable to reconcile what she was seeing with the man she had mocked in front of her own staff only minutes before. The contract mechanic she had dismissed as irrelevant had just resolved a fault that her highly paid director of technical operations had failed to explain for hours. The crew around her had stopped laughing entirely. Cameron's face had gone pale, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to fear, though he tried to mask it behind a tight, unconvincing smile. Amelia searched for a way to preserve her composure, insisting to those nearby that Mason had simply gotten lucky, that whatever he had done was likely temporary and unreliable. Mason did not push back against her words, and he made no attempt to collect on the promise she had made in front of everyone. He wanted nothing from the moment except to make sure the aircraft was actually safe to fly. He told her plainly that the engine could run, but that flying without first tracing the origin of the unfamiliar module inside the aircraft would be a mistake. Amelia, eager to reach Washington before the deal collapsed entirely, brushed the warning aside, insisting there was no time left for further inspection. Mason held his ground, telling her directly that if she flew without understanding what had caused the failure, there was a real possibility of the same fault returning while the aircraft was in the air, far from any runway. For a brief moment, something in Amelia's expression shifted, as though the warning had actually reached her. But Cameron, sensing the danger of further scrutiny, urged her toward the boarding stairs, insisting the schedule could not bend any further. Amelia agreed to a short test flight around the immediate airspace before committing to the longer journey east, a compromise that satisfied no one completely but bought a small measure of caution. Mason remained on the tarmac as the aircraft taxied away, watching its slow, deliberate movement with an unease he could not fully explain. Something about the entire situation felt unfinished, as though the fault he had just corrected was only the visible edge of a much larger problem. Before returning to the hangar, he glanced down at a handheld maintenance device left behind on a nearby cart, and noticed a strange gap in the data, a stretch of missing entries where records should have existed but did not. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, rain collecting on the shoulders of his jacket, watching the jet grow smaller against the gray sky before banking gently back toward the airfield for its short test loop. Somewhere behind him, the hangar had already returned to its usual noise, phones ringing, staff exchanging relieved chatter about the deal in Washington still being alive. None of them had noticed what Mason had just found on the small screen in his hand, and for now, he intended to keep it that way until he understood exactly what it meant. The short test flight ended without incident, and the deal in Washington survived for at least another day, though Amelia returned to the airfield carrying more questions than relief. She could not stop thinking about Mason, about the calm certainty with which he had diagnosed a fault that had baffled her entire technical department. Rather than heading home, she lingered near the hangar office, watching him from a distance as he quietly returned to the maintenance records he had been denied earlier that morning. Mason worked through the logs late into the evening, cross-referencing entries that no longer matched the timestamps recorded on the handheld device. Over the previous 3 months, a pattern began to emerge, one that had clearly been altered rather than simply neglected. Small irregularities involving fuel pressure, electrical load, and auxiliary power cycling had been quietly smoothed over in the official records, each one erased before it could raise an alarm with anyone outside the technical department. While Mason worked, Cameron met privately with a small group of senior managers in a conference room removed from the main hangar floor. He spoke in low, urgent tones, laying out a plan to redirect blame toward Mason should the irregularities ever surface in a formal investigation. Unbeknownst to him, Amelia had walked past the partially closed door and caught a fragment of the conversation, enough to plant a seed of doubt that had not existed in her mind that morning. Back in the technical bay, Mason found something that made the entire situation clearer and far more dangerous than a simple cover-up. Embedded in the module's identifying code was a project designation he recognized immediately: the name of a military initiative that had been quietly terminated years earlier after a serious safety failure. If a piece of that technology had made its way into a commercial aircraft, the implications reached far beyond one company's reputation. Mason understood that if the module had been sold into the civilian market, Amelia's company could be facing far more than embarrassment. Federal prosecution, program shutdowns, and permanent damage to every partnership the company had built were all real possibilities. He decided to bring what he had found directly to Amelia, but as he approached the corridor leading to her office, 2 security officers stepped into his path, blocking him without explanation. Cameron arrived moments later, accusing Mason openly of stealing confidential company data, his voice loud enough to draw attention from nearby staff. Amelia, caught between the man she had trusted for years and the man she had humiliated that same morning, found herself unable to decide who deserved her confidence. She had not yet fully trusted Mason, but Cameron's sudden urgency to silence him felt like a confession all its own. Mason did not fight the security officers or raise his voice to match Cameron's accusations. He simply stood still, allowing them to escort him toward the exit, his expression carrying none of the panic Cameron seemed to expect from a man supposedly caught in the act of wrongdoing. Amelia watched the entire exchange from a few steps away, noticing how differently the 2 men carried themselves under pressure, one loud and defensive, the other calm to the point of unsettling composure. Before security escorted him from the building, Mason left her with a single quiet sentence telling her that by morning someone would call, and after that call no one would be able to hide anything any longer. The next morning, Amelia called an emergency meeting with her leadership team to manage what was quickly becoming an internal crisis. Cameron arrived early, pushing hard for immediate action against Mason, recommending his termination, a formal complaint for unauthorized access to company data, and a permanent ban from ever returning to the airfield. Amelia, exhausted and still uncertain, found herself nodding along, tempted to end the disruption before it grew any larger. Just as she prepared to give the order, the phone in the conference room rang, its sound cutting sharply through the tense atmosphere. A voice on the other end identified himself as Owen, calling from the Pentagon, and the entire room straightened at once, assuming the call concerned the aviation contract or some regulatory matter tied to the company's operations. But Owen did not ask for Amelia. He asked directly and without hesitation to speak with Mason Carter. The request landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Amelia sat in stunned silence, unable to understand why a man she had dismissed as an unskilled contract worker was being personally requested by someone calling from inside the Department of Defense. Owen confirmed in careful and measured language that the module discovered inside the company's jet was connected to a military program that had gone missing years earlier under circumstances still considered sensitive. He explained that Mason had once been among a very small group of civilian technical specialists trained to safely disable that particular locking system without triggering a catastrophic failure in the control cluster. Amelia realized with a mixture of shame and disbelief that what she had witnessed the day before had never been luck at all. Owen's tone grew more serious as he explained the stakes. If the aircraft had left the airfield without the module being properly secured and documented, the situation could have escalated into a matter of national security rather than a corporate embarrassment. Every second the module remained unaccounted for increased the risk, and every attempt to conceal its existence only compounded the danger for everyone involved. Across the table, Cameron's composure finally collapsed. He rose from his chair, mumbling something about needing to check on the hangar, and moved toward the door with an urgency that betrayed far more than he intended to reveal. Before he could leave, the conference room door opened and Mason walked in, calm and unhurried, showing no surprise at all that the call had come, or that it had come for him rather than for anyone else in the building. Amelia rose halfway from her seat, uncertain whether to apologize, explain, or simply hand him the phone. Mason took the receiver from the table without ceremony and greeted Owen by name, a detail that told the entire room this was not the first conversation between the two of them. He listened for a long moment, nodding occasionally, offering short, precise answers to questions only he seemed to fully understand. When he finally set the phone down, every person in that conference room, including Amelia, was looking at him with an expression that had nothing left of the contempt from the previous. Morning. In the hours that followed, Amelia tried to reassert control over a situation that was quickly slipping beyond her grasp. Several members of her board began raising pointed questions, uneasy that the company might be entangled with restricted military technology it had no authorization to possess. What had started as a scheduling crisis over one aircraft had transformed into something far more serious and far more threatening to everything she had built. Cameron, sensing the shift in mood, tried to salvage his position by pretending to cooperate fully with the emerging investigation. He suggested with practiced confidence that Mason had planted the module himself, hoping to manufacture leverage he could later use to extort the company. Mason responded without raising his voice, pointing out the obvious flaw in the accusation. He had not been granted access to the primary installation bay in over 3 months, a fact easily confirmed by the building's own entry logs. Amelia demanded that the full maintenance camera footage be pulled immediately, but technicians quickly discovered that large sections of the recent recordings had been deleted from the central server. It was Mason who remembered something Cameron did not seem to know existed: an older analog recording unit installed in the secondary bay years earlier, one that had never been connected to the company's modern network and therefore remained untouched by whoever had scrubbed the digital archives. For the first time since the ordeal began, Amelia made a deliberate choice to stand beside Mason rather than against him, allowing him to lead her down through the maintenance corridors toward the old recording equipment. The tension in the building rose sharply when security personnel, still operating under instructions from Cameron, attempted to block their path near a restricted access door. Mason did not respond with confrontation or force. He relied instead on his calm familiarity with the building's older systems, guiding Amelia through a technical route that bypassed the blocked corridor entirely. As they moved through the dim maintenance passage, Amelia found herself studying him more closely than she ever had before, beginning to understand that beneath the worn jacket and the quiet manner was a man who had once lived through circumstances far more dangerous than anything her boardroom had ever demanded of her. When they finally reached the old recording unit and located the correct archived tape, what they found confirmed every suspicion that had been building since the previous morning. On the grainy footage, time-stamped well past midnight, Cameron appeared beside the jet alone, working on the very panel that had caused the failure, long before Mason had ever been called in to look at anything at all. Amelia stared at the screen for a long moment, saying nothing, the small room lit only by the faint gray glow of the old monitor. She had known Cameron for years, trusted his judgment through countless decisions that shaped her company, and watching him move so deliberately in that grainy footage felt like watching a stranger wearing a familiar face. Mason gave her space to absorb what she was seeing, offering no remark of his own, understanding that some realizations needed to arrive on their own terms rather than be pushed forward by someone else's certainty. Later that afternoon, in a quiet corner of the hangar office, Mason told Amelia a version of his past that was honest without turning into a long, indulgent retelling. He kept it brief, offering only what she needed to understand the danger they were facing together. Years earlier, he had been part of a small technical team responsible for safety testing on an experimental jet system, one designed with a built-in ability to lock its own engine if it ever detected an attempt at unauthorized control. A serious accident during testing had brought the entire program to an abrupt end, and in the aftermath most of its documentation had been sealed away under strict classification. Mason had personally warned at the time that the underlying technology was far too unpredictable to ever be released for civilian use. Yet somehow, years later, a module built for that very program had resurfaced, quietly installed inside the jet belonging to Amelia's company. The explanation, once it emerged, was simple and damning. Cameron had purchased the module through an unregulated black market conduit, hoping to secretly upgrade the company's flagship aircraft and use the resulting performance advantage to win a major contract through claims of proprietary technology no competitor could match. When the illicit module began conflicting with the aircraft's standard commercial systems, Cameron had chosen concealment over disclosure, quietly editing the maintenance logs each time the fault resurfaced. Amelia absorbed the full weight of what this meant for her company. It was no longer simply a matter of losing money or missing a deadline. Her company now faced the very real possibility of a federal investigation, one that could permanently damage every partnership she had spent years building. Mason, despite everything Amelia had said to him in front of her staff only a day earlier, showed no interest in retaliation or personal vindication. His only concern remained preventing the aircraft from becoming the site of a genuine disaster. Whether in the air or on the ground, sitting across from him, Amelia felt something close to shame settle over her, a recognition that she had judged Mason entirely by his jacket, his quiet manner, and the modest circumstances of his life, without ever considering what he might actually know or what he had actually lived through. Together, they reached a decision that neither of them took lightly. Before Cameron could find a way to destroy the remaining evidence, they would bring everything they had uncovered forward themselves, choosing transparency over the slow, comfortable cover-up that had nearly cost the company everything it stood for. Amelia asked him quietly, almost hesitantly, why a man with his background had chosen to spend years working modest contract shifts instead of returning to a world that clearly still valued what he knew. Mason answered simply that some kinds of quiet were worth more than any title, and that after everything he had already seen, an ordinary life with steady, honest work had become the only kind of peace he still wanted. Amelia did not have a response ready for that, and for the first time since they had met, the silence between them felt less like judgment and more like understanding. Realizing that the truth had already begun to surface, Cameron made the decision to set his final plan into motion. He quietly ordered the ground crew to prepare the jet for immediate departure toward Washington, issuing the instruction under the guise of Amelia's authority, hoping the confusion of an active departure would give him room to escape scrutiny. His goal was simple and desperate: get the aircraft off the ground, let the module disappear into the sky, and leave Mason to absorb every consequence that followed. Amelia discovered what was happening far later than she should have, arriving at the tarmac just as the jet was already being towed toward the runway. Mason understood immediately what the danger meant. If the engine reached full power while the tampered system remained active, there was a real chance the safety lock could trigger mid-acceleration, freezing the controls at the worst possible moment. Owen, still on the line from the Pentagon, urgently requested that the aircraft be grounded and sealed on the spot, but federal personnel were still too far away to arrive in time. With no other option available, Mason moved quickly toward the secondary technical hatch, determined to manually disconnect the module before the aircraft could reach dangerous speed. Amelia followed closely behind him, no longer positioned as the executive giving orders from a distance, but as someone directly accountable for the safety of everyone connected to her company. Inside the control room, Cameron attempted to trigger a remote startup sequence, hoping to force the engine past the point where Mason could safely intervene. Working against a rapidly closing window of time, Mason carried out the disconnection with careful precision, balancing the need for speed against the equally important task of preserving the module as evidence rather than destroying it. Amelia confronted Cameron directly through the airfield's internal communication system, pressing him relentlessly until he finally admitted, in a moment of panic, that he had falsified the maintenance records from the very beginning. Nearby security personnel, listening on the same frequency, heard the confession clearly and moved in to restrain Cameron before he could attempt anything further. Mason completed the disconnection just seconds before the engine would have crossed into a dangerous threshold, and the aircraft rolled to a slow, controlled stop on the wet runway. Federal agents arrived shortly afterward, their vehicles pulling onto the tarmac as rain continued to fall over the grounded jet. Amelia stood beside the aircraft, soaked and shaking, staring at Mason with an expression that held none of the arrogance from the previous morning. In that moment, she understood clearly that the man she had mocked in front of her entire staff had just saved both her company and, quite possibly, the lives of everyone who might have been aboard that flight. Federal agents moved methodically around the grounded jet, photographing the disconnected module and marking the runway with cones while Cameron sat, handcuffed in the back of a parked vehicle, staring straight ahead, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Owen arrived in person not long after, stepping out into the rain in a plain gray coat, offering Mason a brief, firm handshake that carried more weight than any of the shouting from the previous day ever had. Amelia watched the two of them exchange a few quiet words, And for the first time she began to understand the true scope of the world Mason had once belonged to. Cameron was arrested that same afternoon, facing charges connected to falsifying company records, illegally acquiring restricted technology, and endangering the safety of a commercial flight. Several members of the board urged Amelia to keep the entire affair quiet, worried about the damage a public scandal might cause. Instead, she chose to disclose what the law required and address her staff honestly, standing in front of the same hangar where she had humiliated Mason only 2 days earlier. She admitted openly, without excuses, that she had been wrong to mock him in front of everyone, and that her judgment of him had been shaped entirely by appearance rather than substance. Amelia reminded Mason of the promise she had made in the heat of that moment, offering to sign the company over to him exactly as she had said she would. Mason declined without hesitation. He explained that he had no interest in owning a company simply because of a careless remark made in a moment of arrogance. Instead, he asked for 3 things that mattered far more to him than ownership ever could. He wanted contract workers paid fairly and on time, an independent safety fund established to catch problems before they became disasters, and a clear standing rule that no title or position would ever again be allowed to silence someone telling the truth. Amelia agreed to all 3 conditions, not because she felt cornered, but because something in her had genuinely shifted over the course of those 2 difficult days. Owen later confirmed that Mason's record within certain classified technical circles would be quietly restored, though many of the finer details would remain sealed for reasons beyond anyone's immediate control. Mason accepted this news without any visible need for celebration or recognition. He left the airfield that evening, walking through the same steady rain that had been falling since the story began, carrying no announcement, seeking no attention, simply returning to the quiet life he had built for himself and his daughter. Amelia watched him go from beneath the hangar's wide overhang, finally understanding that the man she had once dismissed carried more genuine worth than anyone, seated around her boardroom table. In the days that followed, the jet was formally sealed for a full federal investigation, and the company began the slow, necessary work of restructuring itself around honesty rather than image. Mason eventually returned, not as an employee buried in the lowest ranks, but as an independent safety consultant whose judgment could no longer be ignored or dismissed. The hangar itself felt different in the weeks that followed, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with respect. Staff who had once laughed alongside Amelia now greeted Mason with a nod whenever he crossed the floor, and Cameron's name became something spoken of only in careful, clipped sentences during closed meetings. Amelia found herself running the company differently, slower in some ways, more deliberate in others, weighing every decision against the memory of how quickly pride had nearly cost her everything she had built. Amelia had not lost her company after all, but she had lost her arrogance, and in its place had found something considerably more durable. Mason, in turn, had never wanted the company at all. What he had truly recovered, quietly and without fanfare, was the simple dignity of being taken seriously. Stay with the story until the very end, because the handover was only the surface of a far darker secret.